Today's speaker will be introduced by Athanasios Platias, who is Professor of Strategy at the University of Piraeus and the EU coordinator of the Mackinder Forum. Athanasios?
Good evening from Athens. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to introduce Jacob Sotiriadis, Dr. Jacob Sotiriadis, who is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and he's also an advisor at the State Department, where he trains diplomats on strategic foresight and geopolitical futures at the Foreign Service Institute. He spent more than 20 years in the US Air Force, serving as an intelligence officer. And most importantly, he founded the Air Force's strategic foresight capability. And also he was the first director of the Center for the Future of Intelligence at the National Defense University. He led several forecasting initiatives on geopolitical risk across the defense and intelligence communities, and he's contributing frequently to important media outlets. He is the author of a recent book, The Revenge of Ideology, The Hidden Forces Reshaping the Global Order, which is really the talk that he will give today. He holds a PhD in political science and geopolitics. He holds degrees from the University of Hawaii and the Fletcher School of Diplomacy at Tufts University. So, Jake, it's a great pleasure to see you here, and we are all looking forward to the presentation of your book, from which I understand it's already a bestseller at Amazon. And I have read the first chapter. It's really exciting, and I hope all these participants will get the book.
Thank you so much, Professor Platias, for the very, very kind and warm intro, and also to Len and the Mackinder Forum for this invitation. It is truly an honor to be with you today. So what I'd like to do is dive right into the revenge of ideology. So I'm going to share a presentation that I've prepared for us, and look forward to going through the book and the main arguments of the book, and then look forward to having what I know will be a robust and fun discussion with you all about what we've discussed. So what I want to do is start actually on the first slide here. So the title is the Revenge of Ideology, The Hidden Forces Reshaping Global Power. And I'm going to come back to the subtitle of Hidden Forces, and I think you'll understand why I'm describing these as hidden forces in today's geopolitical competition. So before we talk directly about the book, I thought we needed to go back about 26 years to think about and just take stock of where we are today in the 21st century. And frankly, the disappointment that the 21st century has become for the last quarter of century, based on the expectations that we had. So if we go back to the year 2000, it's very apropos because today President Trump is going to be delivering his State of the Union address here in Washington, D.C. But 26 years ago, Bill Clinton was doing the same thing in Washington. And he made a profound observation at the time. And he says that we are fortunate enough to be alive at this moment in history. Never before has our nation enjoyed at once so much prosperity and social progress with so little internal crisis or so few external threats. And so now Bill Clinton, of course, is my favorite science fiction author, because clearly the world that he describes here couldn't be further from us today. As a matter of fact, it almost seems like he's describing someplace that just doesn't exist anymore. And frankly, the world he described doesn't exist anymore. The question is the fundamental assumptions that we had, particularly in the West, about how the 21st century was going to unfold were completely off base and frankly wrong. And this is really what the book is going to dive into and what it addresses, these questions. Why did I decide to write this book? And why did I pick this topic of ideology? Well, as you can see in the picture, And as was mentioned in the introduction, I spent 21 years in the American security establishment as an Air Force intelligence officer, but also in the intelligence community, teaching at the intelligence community's flagship university. And one particular moment that struck me in 2007, when I was on a deployment to the Middle East, as you can see in this picture, was taking phone calls for support, for aerial support to improvised explosive devices that were happening in Iraq at the time. We were losing helicopters every week. We were taking all sorts of casualties. It was very clear that we had fumbled our way into a strategic fiasco. Afghanistan at the time hadn't quite fallen so far behind. But I sat there and I thought to myself, what is it that we're doing here? How could a sort of ragtag force of insurgents with very little modern technology be pinning down the world's premier military force? How did we get here? Why are Americans from places like Maine and California and Texas, why are they fighting and dying here? And these, of course, aren't questions that were only unique to me. Many were asking these questions. But it really instilled in me this desire to examine why it is that nations would take decisions that are ultimately self-destructive and actually against their rational self-interest. And so we talked about Clinton for a minute, but the assumptions that we inherited from the end of the Cold War really were that because of the great victory of the United States and the West over the Soviet Union and communism, really was that ideology is dead. And of course, no article sums that up better than what I know you're all familiar with, which is Frank Fukuyama's End of History, where, of course, if you were still stuck in the lens of history, then you would still be under ideological power. But ideology essentially was for an old world that didn't exist anymore. We had moved past ideology at the end of the Cold War. And so the idea was that markets, not myths, were going to be driving state behavior. And so any mention to ideology was really dismissed as just sort of window dressing, nothing that really was critical to understanding state behavior. The problem with that is it didn't bear out. And it didn't bear out through the rise of things like radical Islamic terrorism that we ended up dealing with in the late 1990s and, of course, into the year 2000. But this colored the way that the United States and then also the West understood the world and the lens through which it looked at geopolitics. So how did this bear out? I talked about Clinton's State of the Union address, and what did we expect more broadly when I say we? I'm referring to the West in general. The expectation was that the United States would continue unabated to be the dominant geopolitical, military, and economic power in the world, and that through the grand bargain the United States had by maintaining not only global supply chains, but maintaining free lines of trade and communication and commerce, that, of course, globalization was going to create more cooperation on an international level, that this would lead to the spread of more democracy, not less democracy, and that, of course, economic development was fueled by globalization, was going to be the factor that was going to diminish global conflict. And again, this sort of is encapsulated by this idea of the end of history. But what we got was something very, very different. What we got was much, much more disappointing, and it didn't bear out in the way that was expected. What we actually saw was the 21st century up until today. We've now gone through a quarter of it. It's actually been more violent, more disruptive, and more unpredictable than anything we could have imagined. We started off with the worst terror attacks on American soil since at least Pearl Harbor, with the ensuing 2 decades of military adventurism that cost, we don't even know how much it cost. Figures are maybe $4, $5, $6, $7 trillion, hundreds of thousands dead. And then we moved on to the global financial crisis in 2008. If that wasn't enough, we had the worst pandemic in 100 years in 2020. We now have major war returning to Europe. We're probably closer today to thermonuclear conflict than at any time since 1962. We have the explosion of artificial intelligence, which is transforming all levels of our society and geopolitics, which we'll talk about. And of course, in 2000, when Clinton made his speech, China's GDP in 2000 was actually less than that of Italy's. So today, in 2026, it's now 10 times larger, China's GDP. And of course, China is the United States' chief geopolitical rival at all levels, and democracy is retreating globally. So every assumption that we had in the West about how the 21st century was going to play out was fundamentally and spectacularly wrong, every single one. And the reason for that isn't because smart people weren't writing things like the national security strategy. It wasn't because talented people weren't plugged into what was happening in the world, but it was because I submit, and this is the core argument of the revenge of ideologies, that we were examining geopolitics and we were examining global order through a misguided lens. For example, if you look at this chart, this is research from the Heidelberg conflict. This is the Heidelberg Institute for International Affairs. They publish a conflict barometer report every year. It's a wonderful publication, and they go through all of the active conflicts in the world, everything from a brush fire all the way to large-scale conflict like we see in Ukraine. But as I was going through some of their research and multiple years of data, what I came up with and what was fundamental to this book's argument is that actually, if you look at the causes of conflict on a global scale, you'll see here, this is a data set from 2022, that the latest and greatest hits, things that you might associate as being the highest levels, things like conflicts over territory, conflicts over natural resources, conflicts over national power, these are actually not the leading causes of conflict. The leading cause of conflict by far is ideology and conflicts over different visions of system. And so if you think of it this way, I juxtapose this with the national security strategy. This was, of course, before the new national security strategy recently came out. And I said, wow, if we're looking at all of the actual reasons, the reasons for global conflict, what is the driving factor behind global conflict, we're missing the mark. Because nowhere in the United States national security strategy was the word ideology mentioned even once. No nod to ideological power. And so how are we supposed to find a solution to mitigate global conflict if we don't even have the right diagnosis of the origin? And so, of course, this fueled the research as much as anything else. And so the question then is, if you subscribe to the idea that ideology died with the Cold War, and I know that many of the hardcore realists in the crowd are not going to be fans of this argument about ideology, although I think we'll get there too. What happens then is you're left with this very unsatisfying conclusion that if there is no motivating factor except for expanding power or sort of navigating the prisoner's dilemma, then everything that your both allies and adversaries do is seen through this lens of, well, why would they do this, right? It seems very, very irrational. Or you go towards that madman argument of, well, maybe Putin is really crazy, or maybe it's just about strategic miscalculation or overstretch. But what's happening in front of our eyes, and this is why I title this The Hidden Forces Reshaping Global Power, is because we're actually seeing that what is behind global decisions, what is behind a lot of these seemingly irrational foreign policy actions is actually a rationality we don't have the lexicon or the framework to decode, and because we are looking at these problems through a fundamentally flawed analytical lens. And I'll dive into why that is. So the question then is, if you look at what's happening in the world today, if you look at the invasion of Ukraine and all of the geopolitical fallout and frankly the reputational fallout that Russia now has undergone. If you look at questions of why would a NATO ally like Turkey sacrifice a multi-billion-dollar fighter consortium with the United States to buy Russian air defense missiles, or China prioritizing national rejuvenation over market efficiency when it cut almost $1 trillion from its tech sector in 2021, or frankly the United States, which is not immune to this at all, spending over $8 trillion on misguided military adventurism that actually didn't lead to any democracy promotion, but actually harmed the United States' global reputation. And so when you stop being able to read the world, then I think it's maybe time to get some new glasses. It's time to be able to look at the world through a new lens. So I submit, and the main thrust of the book is that we've actually misunderstood what ideology is. And ideology did not die at the end of the Cold War. Ideology is not some theoretical thing that's floating in the air that we can't see, but it is actually the manner in which ideas become material, and then how these material formations lead to path dependencies and patterns of habitual behavior. So ideology here has a very material structure. And what has happened is that ideology didn't die after the Cold War, but it morphed into these networks. It morphed into a complex adaptive system. And these networks today are what are actually driving a lot of the foreign policy decisions that we see as irrational. So it is not some relic of the Cold War. It is not something that others do. If you look at American attitudes during the Cold War, which was certainly the most ideological conflict that we have seen between the US and the Soviet Union, research from then even shows that only the Soviets, to the Western eye, were ideological. The United States was not ideological. Western Europe was not ideological. It was only our adversaries that were ideological. But what happens here is we forget that even after the Soviet Union collapsed, things like free markets, things like human rights, things like international institutions, these are themselves ideological formations. These are not neutral policy views. And we lost the ability in the West. We had a strategic blindness to our own preferences for global order. And so rather than looking at ideology as this system of beliefs, it is truly a material force that is today shaping and reshaping how entire societies understand reality itself. And thus the competition in the 21st century for global order is not just about geopolitics, but actually about competing visions of that reality. And so when we look at this, it's not just about what people think. It actually is that ideology now tells them what is actually thinkable. In order to understand this, the book deploys this core argument and core structure of what I call an ideological power network. And this is the material structure of ideology, and it really is three things: people, elites, and institutions. All of these elements are necessary for the formation of an ideological power network. And the general population of a state, the socio-political elites of a state, and what I call these ideological state apparatuses, or really the institutions, is what matters here for us. The apparatus and that terminology is actually borrowed from Louis Althusser's writings on ideology, and he's one of the first structural Marxists who actually talks about the material structure of ideology. But I'm actually looking at this as a complex adaptive system. And all of these variables, all of these elements interact with each other. And so when we look at, for example, an ideological power network, each of these elements has an equal influence in how the network accelerates. And I'll explain exactly how that functions. And again, I want to foot stomp this because I think it's important to understand that this is not a theoretical exercise. These are living, breathing networks that have taken hold and are actually creating effects and foreign policy decisions today. So again, this is not a theoretical exercise, but these are real world implications. How does this happen? How does ideology become infrastructure? How does it become material? Well, if you look at everything from not only legal codes, but to how technology is deployed, the physical infrastructure, institutions that are actually driving this, it becomes sort of a path that accelerates and is very, very difficult to turn away from. When you have ideology that then hardens into institutions, it is very difficult to sort of change direction. And what we see happening, and this is the revenge of ideology, is that states don't abandon these ideological power networks very easily. They actually double down, even when it challenges what we would call their own rational self-interest. So I mentioned that it didn't die. Ideology didn't die after the Cold War. It was never absent, but we, particularly in the West, we had convinced ourselves that ideology was a thing of the past. It would never return. And if we were still worried about ideology, it was because we were using an antiquated model of looking at the world. But I would argue that there are actually three different mutations that underpin this ideological power network structure. And really, it's this idea today of a civilizational revival where you have states reaching back to their past to resurrect a narrative of glory that can be used from the elites to the population. So if you think of Russia, looking at Moscow as the third Rome, Turkey, and I'll talk about each of these individual ideological models, Turkey's neo-Turkic autonomy, or China's attempt to reverse its century of humiliation and really prove the moral superiority of its own model over the Western model that is out there. And again, institutional embedding is also very, very important, because this is how ideology becomes grounded and how it builds influence within the institutions and the infrastructure of a state, as well as in the minds of the population. And of course, this is not Cold War era sort of propaganda that's just fed from the top down. This is now decentralized media, social media, accelerated via algorithmic warfare, diaspora communities, anything from religious networks and cultural institutions. And I'll give you some examples of where this is playing out in real time today. And again, not just a theoretical exercise. And so the 21st century, if we're going to bin it as something, is actually not post-ideological, as many would posit, but in my view, it's actually hyper-ideological. We just don't have the vocabulary yet to characterize it. So how do we measure this? I showed you before the three elements of an ideological power network: the general population, the socio-political elites, and the institutions. And again, those three elements are necessary and sufficient to act as this complex adaptive system. But we're not really concerned about the speed with which this happens. We're concerned with the intensity of the network. And so there are these four phases of ideological power network intensification, and you can measure where a particular ideological model is in this matrix here. And this is really important, because as not only strategic planners or scholars, or frankly business leaders, understanding where a particular ideological model falls here can give us very important clues about future policy decisions, and also the lens through which a particular state is looking at the world. So at the beginning, you have the initial network formation, the protophase, where you have these actors that are sort of fragmented and coming together around the particular narrative. You have elites sort of harnessing this narrative and the general population connecting. And let me just make one very, very brief intervention when we talk about the general population versus elites and institutions. The general population are not automatons that are powerless here. This isn't some sort of manipulated mass population. If you recall, in the beginning of the 21st century, when the United States Navy EP-3 intelligence aircraft crashed on Hainan Island off the coast of China, we now know from declassified documents that the Chinese government, leadership in the Chinese government, actually wanted to give the plane back to the United States. And don't forget, George W. Bush was just brand new into his term when this happened. And so the Chinese leaders wanted to give the plane back. However, the nationalist fervor that was stoked in the population on all sorts of blogs and even demonstrations in the streets prohibited them from doing this. So the general population in this case was actually a check on the all-powerful elites, which is why I come back to this point that you need all elements of the ideological power network to be able to make this work. Then the network can transition to the metaphase, where you start seeing these path dependencies become established. The apparatuses, the institutions are becoming solidified. We get into very dangerous territory once you cross into the narcissistic phase, where you actually have these actors in the ideological power network becoming lost in their own image. They are unable to view global affairs or even view their own interests outside of what I call this hall of mirrors of their own ideology, their own ideological predilections. And what we see here are instances of very aggressive and violent foreign policy. And the most intense level of ideological ideological network intensification here is what I call hegemonic narcissism. And I'll dive into this, but this is very important because when you reach hegemonic narcissism, your self-interest, for the state is only defined through the lens of this particular ideological model that's there. So ideology can overwhelm regime type. It does not matter if you're an authoritarian regime or if you're a democracy. And I'll give you an example. The United States is probably one of the strongest examples of hegemonic narcissism after 9/11, when you saw a resonance between sort of this idea of a militaristic foreign policy, the messianic mission to promote democracy, which was very much promoted by the George W. Bush administration, even elements of Christian nationalism wrapped up in this. And so you had this model that completely warped 2 decades of American foreign policy and was frankly continued by subsequent administrations. And so you actually have the United States that became the rogue actor in the international system, where it violated its own rules of the road in the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, and then, as if that weren't enough, doubling down in places like Libya and Syria. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, again, you can look at that through the lens of hegemonic narcissism. So this is an important concept as we look at developing a better vocabulary for describing what's happening. And what happens with hegemonic narcissism here is that it doesn't, a state that is in this stage of network intensification, it doesn't actually view itself as ideological. That's why this is so important. It is a complete lack of self-awareness. And so its only perceptions of what its rational self-interest are come from the lens of its own ideological model. And so, of course, this translates into, we don't have a freedom of movement. The only choices are through this ideological model. And if you look at great power competition through the lens of these competing ideological power networks, I think we're going to gain a lot more explanatory purchase on decisions that outwardly may seem irrational, but once we understand this broader logic, they become very, very rational. The other variable that we are dealing with today is this idea of artificial intelligence accelerating ideological power networks. So technology really hasn't changed what ideology does, but the speed with which these networks can form and the speed with the intensity with which they can go through these phases is accelerated in a much greater way than we would have seen 30 or 40 years ago. And that has to do with things like these issues of synthetic narrative production, or understanding that communities that required physical infrastructure now can be brought together digitally. They can be radicalized in a digital space. You have AI being used as a tool to suppress dissent or popular sentiment. And so this idea that now you have an AI-fueled ideological power network is something that, frankly, we don't have the analytic purchase yet on how to necessarily combat and deal with. The other piece here conceptually is this idea of ideological seduction. And I know I'm throwing around more new terminology, but this new terminology is necessary for us to understand how these networks function in the real world today. And I would make the argument that in Iraq in 2003, the United States had overwhelming military and economic power. So it was not a failure to economically or militarily coerce Iraq. However, there was a severe deficit in ideological power because the United States failed to seduce, if you will, the population to embrace a democratic future that it was promoting. And so this idea that you have to have, only material power in international relations is only half of the equation. You need to have both material and ideational power to be able to drive this ideological seduction. And so this is how the socio-political elites are able to attract the general population. And then what happens is eventually these choices are actually really taken through preferences that have been decided for them. So the 3 models that I focus on, the 3 real world networks that are playing out today in geopolitics, there are more, but I decided to pick these 3 because I think they're the most compelling. The first is what I call Neo-Eurasian imperialism in Russia, where Russia itself, this idea that it's not necessarily just an autocracy. In most Western analyses, really like to double down on this idea of democracy versus autocracy, that this is really what the competition is about. But I would argue it's something much more broad than that. And individually, in both, or in all three cases here, in China, in Russia, and Turkey, we're seeing something much more profound and complex taking shape. So Russia becomes a civilizational model in the middle of this religious imperial resurrection. It's underpinned by a view of Russia being a Pacific state, a Eurasian state, a European state. It's understanding that, another reason, again, Neo-Eurasian imperialism, that these decisions for restoring Russia's rightful place in the world and maybe doubling down on decisions, for example, the Ukraine invasion and others, is actually not some sort of diluted decision, but is quite a rational one when you look at it through the lens of Neo-Eurasian imperialism. The same thing in China. I don't believe there's anybody today in China, including those in the Communist Party, that believe that doctrinaire Marxism is actually the way to go. I just don't believe that that's the case. What we see the Chinese Communist Party doing, and specifically since Xi Jinping has taken the reins of power, is actually a look back. And this is why I call China's ideological model today Neo-Confucian communism, because what do we actually see being promoted? It's a model that's maybe Marxist in vocabulary, but very Confucian in hierarchy. The only wholly and uniquely Chinese model that the Chinese regime is able to look back on to be able to capture the whole body politic of Chinese society is Confucianism. It doesn't want to look at Western models here. And so what is it doing here? It's looking at demonstrating the moral superiority of its managed civilizational model over Western neoliberal disorder. Turkey is an outlier in these cases because Russia and China are the primary geopolitical competitors of the United States today. China obviously being much more economically and militarily powerful than Russia. And of course, the two of them are now locked into a strategic alliance. Turkey is a very fascinating case because I used the real world example of what I call neo-Turkic autonomy, because Turkey is much more of a middle power, but it shows us how ideological power networks can take hold of a state that is rooted in a Western alliance structure. Now, you may have heard, and you might likely have heard the terms neo-Ottomanism thrown around, which obviously is a piece of this. But the reason I call this neo-Turkic is because Turkey's global visions are far beyond looking at just the territories of the Ottoman Empire. It's truly a global player. And Turkey has one foot in the West and one foot in the East, and it's increasingly looking towards Central Asia, but it is a global player. And so this is not just looking at Turkey as sort of an outlier in NATO, but it's Turkey actually changing the rules of the game and the rules by which it's going to play by. And if you look at and we can talk about these in more detail, all of Turkey's global military footprint, its expansive actions into Central Asia, that we're actually going to be looking at a pan-Turkic bloc, in my view, becoming a significant geopolitical player over the next 10 to 20 years that is going to dramatically shift the balance of power, not only in the Eastern Mediterranean, but in Central Asia as well, with huge implications for American and European and Eurasian security concerns. My looking ahead at where this could lead based on the ideological power network model here is that we're going to have three global trajectories where we're going to actually have this crystallization of future competing ideological blocks, where you have very distinct ideological spheres emerging. And these are underpinned by things like various types of technological infrastructure. Think about the debate between American and European actors now on 5G networks in Europe, with electronic vehicles, Chinese EVs in Europe, economic systems. Think about the Belt and Road Initiative, governance models, the Eurasian Economic Union that Russia is promoting as an alternative, the digital Silk Road in China, alternative payment systems. The second trajectory is also this idea of network collapse and systemic transformation. And so you may see that several ideological power networks can reach the limits of hegemonic narcissism, and they actually may implode under that kind of pressure. When we think about where is Russia's overreach in Ukraine actually going, or the internal tension within China between political control and economic dynamism. Again, so this is something to think about, but also the hybrid evolution of these networks and the synthesis of these networks. So there are going to be states that are caught in between, where you have competing elements. You have elements of competing ideological power networks. Think about Vietnam or Singapore or the UAE, that have sort of taken elements of both, have their own unique ideological models, and then accelerated by artificial intelligence's ability to enable these new combinations of control. Where I see things moving in the near term based on this is that, over the next 3 to 5 years, I do see that we're going to be moving towards these hybrid systems and, of course, increasing competing spheres of influence. Obviously, the US-China competition is at the top of the list, and there's going to be competing competition for influence over these emerging hybrid states. You could look at also an increased rise of middle powers, countries like Brazil, Indonesia, the UAE, India, maybe even a great power, acting as these ideological bridges and swing actors, of course. And as we look further at things like sovereign AI and nationalized GPUs and things like that, we could actually see that the future technological landscape is actually becoming a blueprint for ideological competition. And of course, AI is accelerating these areas very, very rapidly. One of the solutions I propose for this is, particularly for the US and for Europe, is better understanding how to deal with this phenomenon of ideological competition, recognizing, number one, that ideological power networks exist, and understanding that there are implications for allies and adversaries alike. And so at a systemic level, understanding that material power alone is not enough. Measuring the geopolitical trajectory of countries through their defense expenditures or GDP is simply inadequate. And we've seen that now play out so many times. So at a systemic level, understanding that the playing field has changed, understanding the phases of ideological network intensification. Think about how differently these phases have shifted since the beginning of the network. For example, Iran's ideological power network in 1979 is much, much different than what we're seeing play out today. And we can look at the Iran problem today and the strategic dilemma through the lens of this hardened ideological power network. And of course, there's multi-tiered competition here as well. Competition across global institutions, state structures. Of course, I'm looking primarily at ideological power networks as state-centric, but of course there are elements of these networks that transcend the boundaries of states as well. But ultimately, this is about competing visions of global order that are seen through these ideological power networks. So what does this mean for us? We need to understand how to map the trajectory of ideological power networks with the same rigor that we use for military capabilities. It's not enough to just understand, again, that's why I footstomp that ideology is not something that is sort of floating out there, but these living, breathing networks are exerting true influence on state level decision making. And so from the West's perspective, we've got to be able to embed our democratic values, not only in our rhetoric, but also in infrastructure and technology and alliances. And of course, a very healthy dose of self-awareness. I would argue today, and I'm happy to talk about this further, that the United States itself is in the middle of two competing ideological power networks. One that was very much a post-Cold War status quo of democracy promotion and promotion of free markets and promotion of globalization. And the emerging ideological power network, which is much, much more based on a reassessment of America's fundamental role in the world. What should the role of the United States be? Questioning the grand bargain, questioning America's role as security guarantor, and of course, even questioning, in some cases, relationships with traditional allies. The other piece here, which is very important, is that technological standards, the regulatory frameworks, and of course, the actual marketplace for technology in the future itself becomes an ideological battleground. So I mentioned sovereign AI, every payment system, standard setting bodies. These are things that will characterize the competition of the future. And so the states that can understand this, while also maintaining a healthy awareness of their own ideological model, their own vulnerabilities, are the ones that will really dominate this future competition. And this is so important because as we think about ideological power networks, being able to understand the second and third order effects of all of these decisions on a geopolitical, on a global scale for geopolitics is certainly not a luxury. It's something that we see now taking on much, much more importance as we are really navigating, in my view today, an era of unprecedented complexity on a global scale, where antiquated frameworks, and this is the reason why I wanted to augment what I saw as inadequate international relations theory with updated concepts to better explain why a lot of these emergent phenomena were occurring and why, particularly in the West, we've continuously been surprised over the last 30 years by things that we had assessed were not supposed to happen, were not supposed to play out the way that they did. So the reality is, where we are today, the revenge of ideology is here. This is not a post-ideological world. It is a hyper-ideological world, but it's very much run on tools from the previous era, on post-ideological era. And the problem here is that if you continue to dismiss ideology as rhetoric, if you continue to adopt the view that it's mere window dressing and that ideology is completely irrelevant, I believe that those states that have that view will continuously be blindsided. They will always be struggling to catch up. And I will leave you with the thought that if the 20th century was defined by markets, today the 21st century is being defined by myth that is exemplified and weaponized by things like artificial intelligence that can serve and frankly benefit those who deploy them most effectively. With that, I will leave you with, happy to take any questions. I appreciate, again, the kind invitation. It's wonderful to be here. And I look forward to our discussion following our presentation. Thanks.